So I'm going to talk a little bit about what trauma is and how it affects the brain, and some classroom strategies to support our students who've experienced different types of trauma, and then talk just briefly about secondary trauma and trauma fatigue that we as teachers might experience and some strategies for supporting teachers. So a working definition of trauma that I'm using is resulting from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that an individual experiences as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that have lasting adverse effects. And so, of course, our friends in Puerto Rico are having some trauma stemming from natural disasters, and hopefully we all can support them with donations and being part of this today. Some different types of trauma. There are 5 different categories of trauma that psychologists often use. Acute trauma is a single incident. So we might think of like a car accident or, again, a natural disaster. Chronic trauma is multiple incidents experienced over time. Complex is 2 or more different types of trauma. Insidious trauma is indirect trauma due to where a person lives. So it could be, for example, that a child lives in a dangerous neighborhood and having to walk to school through that neighborhood is stressful and traumatic for that student. And then historical trauma is sort of a new thing that people are looking at, but there's evidence now to support that trauma can actually be passed down through our DNA. And here in the United States, we see that often with people from underrepresented groups, like people from the First Nations or indigenous cultures. In addition to those types of trauma, there has been a study out called ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And what this doctor found was he worked with thousands and thousands of patients. And in talking to them, he found out that the more negative childhood experiences they had, the more likely they were to have chronic health problems as an adult. And so those are like physical abuse or neglect, living with a caretaker who is struggling with substance abuse or mental health problems. And the more of these adverse childhood experiences you have, the more likely you are, or the more susceptible you are to chronic illnesses such as diabetes or asthma, things like that. So basically what all of that shows us is that we absolutely are going to have students who have experienced some sort of trauma or are struggling with trauma in our classroom. And we might not know if they choose not to disclose that to us, but we probably should know a little bit about how we can best support them. So trauma actually affects the brain. And I like to use Dan Siegel's model of the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain in order to think about what trauma, how trauma impacts us. So if my hand is a brain, and this is my spinal cord, and we have the downstairs brain, and this is the part of the brain, the only part of the brain that's fully formed at birth. And that is responsible for our basic life functions like breathing and digestion. And then the upstairs brain, that part of the brain is more of our higher order thinking. Language development is there, fine motor skills is all housed in the upstairs brain. And then here in the middle, we have the amygdala, or emotion control. And so as our brain develops, we're able to better control our emotions than when we're an infant. And these steps become important to think about later too. So when we experience trauma or some sort of stress, we go into what is called flight, fight, or freeze. So if a giant bear came into this room right now, I might run, I might try to fight it, but probably not, or I might be paralyzed with fear. And what happens physiologically is that all of these stress hormones flood into my downstairs brain. And so those basic functions, my heart rate speeds up, there's more blood to my muscles and my brain. So we hear stories of people who are able to run very fast or have superhuman strength in a time of crisis. So all of those hormones are here in our downstairs brain to help us survive. And we have these cortisol receptors. I like to think of them as buckets. And so they sweep up that stress hormone. So when this traumatic occurrence is gone, we can go back into our upstairs brain. Well, what happens is for children who experience a lot of trauma, it's harder for them they're always living in this downstairs brain. It's harder for them to get to that upstairs brain. And that is all of the stuff that we need to be successful in school. So some of the effects of trauma on behavior and learning, what we might see is students acting out. They might have trouble with memory or reading ability, planning, attention, or focus. But the good news is, because at this point, this has seemed really depressing, the good news is that there's this awesome thing called neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to rewire itself. So if we think of those stairs that are flooded with our stress hormone, the brain can actually form new ladders to get to that upstairs brain. Children are resilient and brains are flexible, and we can actually reverse impacts of trauma. And the number one thing that can help us to help students become resilient, the number one thing in their life is having one adult who is there for them, that they can trust, that's supportive, that they feel completely safe with. So of course, we would hope that that person would be able to be a parent or caregiver. That's not always the case for students, but the awesome thing is that person could be a teacher. So we can actually make a huge difference in the lives of students who are struggling with trauma. So at this point, I have been talking for close to 10 minutes. One thing that we can do is have students take a brain break to sort of resettle themselves if they're feeling anxious. And I can't see you, but maybe you'll try a brain break, one of these with me. So 4 + 1 is breathing in for 4, holding it for 1, and then breathing out for 4. With small children, I like to do things like you have a bowl of soup, smell the soup, and cool the soup. And you can do similar things with a flower and a candle, or props, having students try to blow a piece of cotton across the desk, for example. And again, it just gives our brain a chance to refocus and resettle. So what are some things we can do in our classroom? The most important things that I've read about are building relationships, fostering safety and trustworthiness, engaging in choice and collaboration, and then trying to help with skill building to build those ladders to the upstairs brain. So of course, students who have experienced trauma often are a little bit anxious, sometimes have trouble developing relationships with others. So it's good for us to be patient if we can and mirror back to students what we're seeing. So if a student is acting out, we can say, I see that you're upset. It looks to me like you're upset. Here are some choices of what we can do next. The most important thing, or the quickest and easiest thing we can do, is try to maintain a predictable schedule or routine. If we can post that on the board, it's even better. So often with people who have experience trauma, it's that feeling of not being in control, being caught off guard. And so if they can see what's coming next, that can definitely help calm nerves. This bullet I have about leaving the door ajar is interesting. For some students, if you close the door of your classroom, they might feel trapped, like there's no way to escape, and that can elevate anxiety. But then for other students, if you leave the door open, they might feel exposed. And so what can we do? As teachers, we can't win. So one option is to leave the door slightly ajar, and then again to offer that choice. Where would you like to sit? So the student who feels like they need an out to feel safe can choose to sit by the door. And the student who needs to feel enclosed to feel safe can try sitting in a corner. Again, with choice, so important. Anytime we can give any student at any age any kind of choice, it helps them to feel in control of a situation, and often their lives feel largely out of control. So any kind of choice we can give. Sometimes offering the option of partner work or individual work, for example, or you may do this or this as an assignment. Those little options can help students feel empowered and safe. So another thing that can become important is helping students, again, at any age, to identify how it is they're actually feeling. If we can identify that emotion, sometimes that can help us to identify it and move through it. So I really love this chart. I use it with all age levels, and with brand new English language learners, I just have them put a marker of how they're feeling, and I have a quick visual. I can just glance around the room and I can see where the markers are. And if I have a student who is feeling angry, I know that I want to be especially careful and supportive with that student. We have started teaching, like one of our very first units for English with our brand new learners is language of emotions, because in identifying that emotion, it can really help us to be able to share how we're feeling and to open up opportunities for learning to take place. So again, we want to try to create new neural pathways or new bridges to the upstairs brain, because they often get flooded with this stress hormone, and we want students to feel safe and valued. So when you look at these teaching strategies that researchers have identified as helping build new neural pathways, they look like everything we already do as language teachers. So yay for us. Repetition, 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 and reviewing, trying to present information in multiple modes. So I'm going to say it, I'm going to have it written down. Perhaps we can use a total physical response with that. Graphic organizers and images, step-by-step instructions, scaffolding, and modeling. We already do these things as language teachers, so it's good to know that we're already being trauma sensitive in our practice. We also want to try to focus on helping students to feel safe in our classroom. We can't control what's going on out in the world. Sometimes there's scary things going on outside in the world, but we can control what's happening in our classroom. And so if we can focus on hope as much as possible, focus on the present. For a lot of students, maybe the past was not good, was really scary, and we don't really want to go back there. For some students, they can't even think about the future. They need to just think about this moment and getting through these few minutes, maybe this day, maybe this week. So if we can focus on the present, that can be helpful for students too. So what I have here is a chart of examples of trauma-sensitive teaching, and these are just kind of tweaks. So in the instead of column, these are all things either I have done in the past or I've observed my students who are practicing to be teachers, I've observed them do. So when I was a high school English teacher for 13 years, and one of my favorite assignments was connected to Walt Whitman's Song of Myself, the poem. And so what I would have the students do to work on symbolism, I would have them bring in an item that celebrated their past, an item that celebrated their present, and an item that celebrated or symbolized their future. And they would share those items with the class and work on speaking skills. Well, now that I've read lots and lots and lots about trauma-sensitive teaching, I have learned that that was probably not the best assignment that I could have given my students. And I could easily tweak it to make it more trauma sensitive. So I could instead ask my students to bring an item that symbolizes or celebrates their past, their present, or their future. And in doing that, I'm not re-traumatizing by forcing them to think about maybe something that happened in the past. I'm giving them choice. So you can see some of these other assignments. I watched one of my students who's practicing to be a teacher give the assignment of write about a time when you felt scared, and it was not good for all students because we were reminding them of a past that was really scary. So instead, when I talked to her about what we could do differently, I talked about maybe write about a time you felt a strong emotion, and that could be joy or that could be excitement, or maybe it is being scared, but again, give that choice. So secondary trauma and compassion fatigue are real. Teaching is hard. Research shows us that teachers experience as much stress as paramedics and police officers. And in the UK, teaching was ranked as the #1 most stressful job. In the US here, 40% of teachers leave the profession within the first 5 years and often indicate that the stress is part of that. So secondary trauma is when our students tell us about traumas they're experiencing, and just in hearing those stories, we're traumatized too, obviously not to the same extent, but it can upset us, it can invade our thoughts. Compassion fatigue is when we hear story after story after story of trauma, and eventually we almost become numb to the traumas our students are experiencing. Symptoms of having secondary trauma or compassion fatigue: feeling guilty, insomnia, burnout, this minimizing where maybe your friend wants to complain about a bad day and you want to compare, like, you think you had a bad day, you should hear what one of my students is going through. And none of these things are healthy for us as educators. So what can we do? The cliche, put your own oxygen mask on first, is really, really important. We can't be good teachers and support systems for others if we're not taking care of ourselves first. So we need to try to eat well and sleep and exercise and relax and have fun and set boundaries and try to leave work at work. And if we can't do that every day, at least a couple of days a week. Research also shows us that access to similar others is really, really important. So checking in with our colleagues, how are you doing? Let's share. We don't have to complain, but we can just share with others who understand what we're going through, and that can help us too. And of course, in all cases, seek professional support when needed. So to conclude, I think the takeaways I was hoping for, realizing the prevalence of trauma. We are going to have students who've experienced trauma in our classrooms. We need to recognize how trauma affects the brain, especially with learning and emotion and behavior control, because that really impacts the classroom. And we can respond with actions, little actions, just like the strategies that I shared, and of course, always resist re-traumatizing our students and ourselves by taking good care. So I thank you all for your time, and I hope everyone feels moved to donate to this great cause.